Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is the second panel that we're having. My name is Tom Strathclyde, and I'm going to be chairing this particular group of people. Now, I expect that some of you are wondering what is the CPTPP, or maybe you are already great experts on it, but we have aligned today a group of people who really do know a great deal about it, a great deal about this subject, and are prepared to share it with us. I'm going to ask them to come up in this order, or to speak in this order from their seats. First of all, the Honourable George Brandis, who is the High Commissioner for the UK from Australia. Secondly, we have Philip Bouvera. Philip Bouvera comes from JCB and does everything that is international for that body. And he brings a level of private sector expertise and knowledge to our deliberations today. Next to him is Stephanie Beck, the Deputy High Commissioner, the Canadian Deputy High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. And then finally, we have a Member of Parliament, Anthony Mangnall, who is the MP for Totnes. More important than that, even, he's on the Trade Select Committee, and I'm delighted to say that Anthony is co-authoring with the CPS a pamphlet about the CPTPP. So we have real expertise on this panel. I very much hope that they will be able to explain a little bit more about the ins and outs of the negotiations that will no doubt take place and the benefits that will accrue not just to the United Kingdom but to all signatories of the deal. Thank you very much indeed for coming along. George Brandis.
Well, thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In case there is anybody in the room who doesn't know what CPTPP stands for, it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, whatever its other virtues, makes it the most adjectively incontinent trade deal in the world. It didn't begin as the CPTPP, it began as the simple TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was originally of 12 nations, and then President Trump decided to withdraw the United States from consideration, with, by the way, importantly, the possibility of subsequently rejoining. After discussions, particularly between New Zealand and Australia and Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, it was decided that the 11 continuing nations would persevere with a Trans-Pacific Partnership. During the course of that process, it acquired its 2 additional adjectives, so it was decided to call it comprehensive and progressive. I'm not sure why, though I'm sure it will be. The CPTPP was affirmed. The United Kingdom indicated last year its firm desire to accede to the CPTPP, and the CPTPP Commission decided on the 2nd of June this year formally to commence accession negotiations with the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom being the only non-Pacific nation thus far to have reached that stage of accession negotiations. Australia supports the United Kingdom's accession to the CPTPP. We welcome more broadly, since Brexit, the United Kingdom's emergence on the global stage as an independent voice for free trade, and we encourage British membership of the CPT as of other multilateral trade agreements. We also, of course, welcome the United Kingdom's independent voice in the WTO as a voice to prosecute the case for global trade. Now, the CPTPP at the moment comprises nations which together constitute 16% of global GDP, about £9 trillion in aggregate GDP among the 11 member states. With the accession of the United Kingdom in round figures, that will make it about 19% of global GDP, about £11 trillion. You've had from Anne-Marie Trevelyan and from Crawford Faulkner and others in the previous panel expressed in various ways the fundamental proposition that we all well know, and that is the region broadly defined as the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, which, by the way, is not coextensive with the coverage of the CPTPP, but nevertheless is an overlapping and broadly hemispherically congruent area, is where the future of world economic growth, the expansion of the global population, the rise of the middle class will be for the rest of the century and as far as the eye can see. As Britain emerged from the EU and embraced as an inevitable corollary, as it seems to me, of Brexit, the notion of re-emerging as a global force, not merely a European and transatlantic nation, but a nation which defined its interests as being global interests. The most obvious and indeed inevitable part of the world for Britain to interest itself in was the Indo-Pacific. Now, leave the Indo side. I know note what Peter Mandelson had to say in relation to the Indian side of the equation, or the Indian Ocean side of the equation. We're just focusing on the Pacific, and particularly the East Asian perimeter of the Pacific. Plainly, that is a region rich with opportunities, in which there is an eagerness to expand trade. And at a time when there are so many influences in global politics which are either reluctant about, hesitant towards, or resistant to the expansion of the free trade agenda, you will find that sentiment less evident in East Asia, in the western perimeter in particular of the Pacific Ocean, than you will find it elsewhere in the world. Australia, and I see my friend Bede Corrie, the New Zealand High Commissioner, there in the middle of the room, and I'm sure the same would apply to New Zealand as well. Australia is a nation which for more than 30 years now, under governments of both sides of politics, has prospered from free trade. And I must say, as Australia's diplomatic representative in the United Kingdom, what greatly surprised me was the fact that the case for free trade has to be made so vigorously in the United Kingdom. When I went to my first NFU conference in 2018, I thought I was in the 1840s, and we were arguing about the Corn Laws and whether the repeal of the Corn Laws was such a good idea. And every now and again, including very, very recently, we hear echoes of the argument, well, you know, we need to keep the price of food dear because that's good for the farmers. Well, you know, that's a 19th century argument. Australia has become one of the most prosperous nations in the world because, not merely because we have abundant resources, but because we have taken advantage of the opportunities that free trade offers. You won't find an argument in Australia today against free trade, except in some obscure economics faculty at a second-tier university or from some dinosaur trade unionists. The public is sold on the benefits of free trade from their own lived experience. And to my Australian ears, it is such a delight to me to hear the argument, to hear the case being made by people like Anthony Mangnall, from whom we'll hear in a moment, and so many others in Boris Johnson's government, and to hear Anne-Marie Trevelyan's enthusiasm in her keynote speech this morning. Let me, Tom, finish on this point. In her first major speech as Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, fresh from the experience of having been International Trade Secretary at the Tory conference, made the point that Britain's strategic global interests and her trading interests are effectively two sides of the same coin. Global Britain isn't just about trade. It's about the definition of strategic and security interests. It's about diplomacy. It's about development. It's about the disposition of forces. It's about many things. But all of those things are increasingly and inevitably linked. And the reintroduction of the United Kingdom into Australia's region of the world, into the Eastern Hemisphere, for all of those reasons, but germane particularly to today's discussion, for commercial reasons, is very welcome news to Australia's ears. We strongly support the endeavours of your government in doing so, and we are very confident from our own lived experience as a free trading nation for decades now, that it will redound to the benefit of your people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Philip Bouverard.
Thank you, Lord Strathclyde. I'm going to take a slightly different approach. We've just had a very well-ranging technical discussion on CPTPP. I just want to be a bit more practical about it from the history of our company. And for those of you who thought you were going to hear from the Japanese credit bank, that's not me. We make yellow diggers, and we sell them around the world from 24 factories, 12 of which are outside Europe. The other 12 are in the UK. So we've got a bit of experience. I remember sort of standing in front of a map of the world, sort of hands on hips staring at things, because you're always looking at where can we sell next. And I used to think of the Pacific Rim as a very rich area to go for. We always knew that, certainly on the western side, the Southeast Asian countries of Thailand, Malaysia, particularly Indonesia, were potential rich pickings for a company like ours. And as we sort of embarked on our journey, probably 25 years ago, to have a target of 10% world market share, which we actually reached momentarily before the Chinese started making a lot more, and we're back to about 9%. But we know that around the world, on an aggregate basis, if there's a hole being dug, there's a 10% chance we're digging it. So this all started from the UK, and it really was in the days where there was a lot of protectionism all around the world. So it won't surprise you to know that our first factories were in India, followed by Brazil, and then a small factory which we put in China for some other reasons. But we were always fighting against what were protectionist countries. So we wound up with this spread of factories: India, China, Brazil. I'm not going to say the United States was protectionist, but we did have to put one there, mainly to supply the US military. But throughout this process, we were always looking for an easy window to get through, or something we had to jump in and change something to actually make it work. And it was normally technology transfer, which gave us the right to import other things or other technologies into those factories free of import duty. So to us, a free trade agreement is fantastic. The CPTPP gives us tremendous opportunities, not only trading between those partners, but all over the world. To give you an idea, we've been in India for probably 30 years now, possibly 35, if you consider importing complete product, but manufacturing sort of in anger for 30 years. And in that time, we've produced up to 94% indigenous supply, taking some people with us, doing a bit of it on our own, and generally speaking, trying to make sure that those key quality components that still come from those fantastic manufacturers in Japan and latterly a bit more in China, we can still get them into our supply chain. Now, we can talk about supply chain a bit later, but I see that there's a tremendous benefit to CPTPP coming online as fast as possible. We will get lower import duties, collectively and bilaterally. We will, as a manufacturer, be able to stave off some of the rampant inflation that we have in our global supply chains. And these deals will actually give us just better access and less documentation. And of course, those little 5 or 10% of import duties really do stack up. So from my point of view, life after CPTPP will improve. It'll improve our efficiencies globally. It'll improve our supply chain costs, I hope. And I'd like to just sort of have a more practical view on everything we're talking about today. What does it do for us? The answer is we can expand more, we can employ more people, we can make more revenue for our shareholders and the Treasury here in the UK, which is still our headquarters. We haven't moved offshore. We're here.
Thank you very much. Stephanie, please, if you would like to speak now, the Deputy High Commissioner to the UK of Canada. Thank you very much, Stephanie Beck.
Thank you. Maybe I'll go a little broader than some of this, what we've been talking about. And really, it's because of where we are now in time, right? As we're coming out, we hope, of the pandemic, or learning to live with something that's endemic and that will be with us forever in one form or another. I think every government around the world is looking to create a new trading environment that enables us to build back not only better, but greener, more resilient. In Canada's case, our focus is also on ensuring that our most vulnerable communities who are hardest hit by COVID benefit from this resurgence of growth that we're seeing now in many economies around the world. Open, free, and fair international trade is central to this and is central to jobs and prosperity and growth that works for everybody. Here in the UK, you refer to it as leveling up. In Canada, we have a similar kind of process looking to ensure that people all across the country, from the Arctic down to our border with the US, reap the benefits. So to do this, we're following several different priorities, but in particular, global rules-based multilateralism, of course, so reforming the WTO. In fact, one of the first things the UK did when it was able to post-Brexit was join the Ottawa group that is focused with a group of like-minded countries on reforming the WTO with an improved and fully functioning dispute settlement mechanism. Of course, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I'm not going to try and say it in French today, mais si vous voulez, peut-être une autre fois. And we're really pleased that the UK is the first accession candidate, and we're working through that process with the other members currently of the CPTPP. But just on that, and I'm sorry to say we are free trade proponents as well, because he wanted a little more argument than that, but we could make stuff up later if necessary. But Canada has long had a policy of basically having a free trade agreement with every possible region around the planet, and we are one of the G7 countries that do that in a very deliberate manner. And this is exactly for the same reason my colleague from the Australian High Commission, George Brandis, said, we have a small market at home, but we have a lot of things to sell. And this is how we know we are going to make our own country more prosperous. Just as in brackets there, the pandemic did cause a lot of people to look internally at home too, and I know this happened in the United Kingdom, and there was a bit of, well, maybe we should keep our food, or maybe we should figure out a way of ensuring we have components of all the pharmaceuticals that we need grown here at home too, and maybe free trade just means we're giving it to somebody else. So that's another aspect that we could look into in more detail going forward. But with the UK, we work very closely on a range of multilateral issues. Of course, we were here through all the G7 meetings. Our trade minister, the Honourable Mary Ng, was here most recently for the third of the trade ministers that happened. You will have seen that, because I'm sure you all read, the final communique that came out of that meeting, and again, a shared commitment to the reform of the World Trade Organization. And our own G7 principles, there was reference to it earlier on digital trade and the practical steps that we're taking to eliminate forced labor in supply chains. I guess that's the other thing. We see free trade agreements as a way of dealing with all kinds of other social challenges that are impediments to prosperity. So I think free trade agreements in general have evolved from decades ago when they were really about tariff barrier elimination and maybe food labeling issues, and now they go much farther than that to touch on environmental and climate change issues. And I think that's where we can see the potential going forward. Specifically on CPTPP, so it was designed that other countries can and should exceed, and it's great that the UK is the first one. It's actually really important that we do it well. UK and CPTPP negotiators have been meeting day and night since the original announcement, and I know it's been arduous, but it is critical that the UK demonstrate integrity in the accession process, because they are setting the bar, right? This is a precedent. And we all know that China and Taiwan have both indicated an interest in joining. So what we do with the UK will be leading the path for those other countries who wish to join going further. And any watering down of the agreement would be to the detriment of all of the countries and the economies that are already in there, and frankly, any future ones. On free trade agreements more generally, as I have said, something Canada pursues deliberately, almost religiously, something extremely important to our governments, and I would say governments of all kinds. In fact, just last week, we agreed with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations that we would be pursuing free trade agreements with them. The specific one with the United Kingdom, we're already in exploratory discussions, of course, but consulting domestically, as has the UK been doing here. And our negotiators are starting to meet in the initial discussions, and we expect to launch the full formal negotiations early in the new year, which would be about a year after our trade continuity agreement came into play. That's the one we put into place post-Brexit, after our Canada-Europe free trade agreement, and before this one comes into play. We're expecting this new one with the UK to be extremely ambitious. It would be in line with what the UK government has been talking about, and certainly what our priorities are going forward. Inclusive, attentive to the needs of the outcomes, for instance, of the recent climate change negotiations at COP, and going forward, especially, as I mentioned, trying to address the issues raised by the most vulnerable. Canada has included discussions with businesses owned by women, youth, immigrants, and others who are generally unrepresented in these kinds of consultations, so that going in, we have the information we need for the negotiations, so that the document is representative of what we're going to need. It's not in 5 years, in 10 years, it's going forward for the next 20, 30 years. We need to be planning ahead. So we have dedicated chapters in our free trade agreements for gender, for small and medium-sized enterprises, for Indigenous peoples. These, of course, differ depending on which region or which countries we're dealing with, but we know these are issues on which we are very like-minded with the United Kingdom. We set up dedicated mechanisms to deal with these, and committees, so that we have a structure in place that we don't forget about what we have promised once the deal is already in place. So all this to say, we have great potential going forward, and we know that it pays off, because we've seen the difference in our bilateral trading numbers and significant percentages, which inevitably mean good things for businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And last but not least, of course, Anthony Mangnall, who is a Member of Parliament.
Thank you very much. I feel like the junior on this panel, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who have got great expertise and interest in this area, and I can assure you that if I lose my place, I won't start referring to Peppa Pig World. However, it seems sort of remarkably prescient that 33 years after Margaret Thatcher's speech in Bruges about the value of an open Europe that was dedicated and driven towards signing free trade agreements, the UK now has an opportunity to do so. And what we are doing is, as was said in 2019 when Liam Fox was here, which is what trade is about. It's about spreading prosperity. It's about that underpinning social cohesion. It's about that underpinning political stability, and that having a role in our security and our defense. And we heard from the Secretary of State earlier today about Global Britain. It's the phrase that we all repeat time after time after time, but we never draw down into the very specifics of what it is and what it means to this country and what it should be in reflection of our trade deals, but also our defense agreements, our diplomatic relationships, and our international development. And that's what it is. It's those 4 pillars. And whether it's AUKUS, which is a hugely successful agreement that is going to draw a huge amount of jobs and opportunities from it, but an important reflection of the divided world that we now sit in. It's much more divided than we know, than we've seen in the last sort of 20 to 30 years. And those 4 pillars have to be reassessed, reignited, and rejuvenated. And so with the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and if you can say it after a drink, you're doing very well, by the way, it is an opportunity for the United Kingdom not only to join the fastest growing trading region in the world, to be a massive part in those agreements with those countries, but also to update and modernize, as we've heard from previous speakers, around the WTO. We know that the WTO has been slow, and by the way, this isn't a new argument. This is an argument that was being made 3-4 years ago. And so the issues around, say, digital trade or IP or GDPR are still having an impact on the agreements that we're trying to sign. And so I go slightly to what Crawford said, which is that we are creating these new plurilateral systems that will hopefully, possibly, converge in future years to create an opportunity to push the international rules that we sign when it comes to trade. It's a massive opportunity for us, and I think the UK is, as ever, and I might just say, the CPS has done some extraordinary work on this, but Robert's article yesterday in the papers that it's not all bad in the UK is a good reflection of the fact that we talk down many things in this country. The fact that we've struck 70 trade deals already is remarkable, but the fact that we are already striking a trade agreement, a new, completely new trade agreement with Japan, is remarkable. And the fact that it includes new benchmark policies on digital trade is something that is undoubtedly going to be included in CPTPP. So the opportunity that we're going on here is that actually we're doing quite well on this. And what we're trying to do with Singapore through the Digital Partnership Agreement, what we are doing at the moment with Australia and New Zealand offers huge opportunity for us to be able to do more in this sphere, but also to modernize the WTO, to push it along in a way that is absolutely essential for the future of trade, and that with the hope that it will join up with other organizations. I've just written a report with the Centre for Policy Studies on CPTPP, and its angle, of course, is looking at the economic benefits, the trade benefits, but also the geopolitical angle, and whether we are meant to be containing, competing, or challenging China. This is the opportunity for us to push China, to actually try and draw it in, to upgrade its standards. And for anyone that doesn't believe that it can be done, I use the smaller example of what Michael Froman said, a US trade representative, US trade ambassador, I beg your pardon, who talked about how CPTPP was helpful in drawing up Vietnam standards to get it into the membership of this organization. There's a huge potential for us actually to lead where there is very little leadership at the moment. So we've got these opportunities. We have this chance to refresh and rejuvenate the international rules. And the third point I just want to make in this area is the export potential. We spend a great deal of time talking about the impact of imports on the UK, and the High Commissioner made the point about farming. We spend a great deal talking about that, but not about the potential that our farmers have to export to Australian, New Zealand, Asian markets, where there is huge demand for the high-quality produce that we produce in this country. Of course, we can talk about farming, and we do spend a great deal of time talking about farming, but it's also about the services. We are predominantly a service-based economy. We have to push this further, and the opportunity in the Indo-Pacific is fantastic, but again, does not get much attention. And the last thing I just want to touch on before we go into the questions is COVID has shown the fragility of the global supply chain. And arguably, if you go to any port in the world, you're still seeing that supply chain try and kick back into action. That fragility has scared a lot of people. Opportunities, whether it's CPTPP, whether it's bilateral agreements, whether it's new plurilateral organizations, offer the chance to be able to, and sorry to steal the phrase, but to turbocharge global trade again, to actually reignite it and ensure that actually we've got securer, more diverse supply chains that don't point us just in one direction or to one country, but give us more chance and more variance. And I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for that explanation. Well, look, ladies and gentlemen, you just had a magnificent primer on FPTPP, what it means. But I suppose one of the good things is that they're all in agreement. They all have tremendous enthusiasm. You heard Anne-Marie Trevelyan earlier on talking about her dreams and wishes, but yet I think there are problems in all of this, and we ought to try and tease them out. First of all, on free trade itself, are we sure that we've really won this argument about free trade? Aren't we really back in the 1840s talking about the Corn Laws, the modern equivalent of the Corn Laws? Are we sure that out there that people aren't attacking globalization, that we haven't seen a huge increase in tax, the state is back, choice is down, and behind that comes protectionism globally, and isn't going to be a huge problem for treaties like this and finding the way to go ahead. And let me mention that the closing minutes of the last session, we talked about agriculture. Last time I was here with the CPS, 2 years ago, we had the US ambassador who felt he had to devote a large part of his speech talking about chlorinated chicken. Now, that was then, this is now. Now, Australia and Canada in particular. What are the equivalents? What have we got to beware of? What do we need? What are the intellectual high ground that we need to win in order to convince people that these sort of free trade agreements are the right way, not just for ourselves, but for all the people who are signatories to it, and making sure that we win that argument?
First of all, the first point I'd make, Tom, is that I think the resistance let's take the discussion about the Australia Free Trade Agreement, which will no doubt spill over into discussion of the CPTPP because there are similar equities. I think it's very narrow. My sense and I've engaged, as Anthony knows, with a lot of members of the government, both the front bench and the back bench, is there are very few who are, and indeed the opposition as well, who are resistant or reluctant. But understandably, there are sectoral interests, particularly in the agricultural sector, which need to be consulted. So the first point is that I think the support, certainly across the government and more broadly I think in the Parliament, for the free trade agreement with Australia, undoubtedly, and the awareness that the opportunities in the Indo-Pacific and the opportunities presented by the CPTPP and the Pacific Rim nations are not to be lost or squandered, that is where the argument is at. Notwithstanding that that not everybody is on board, I think that's where overwhelmingly people are. Secondly, of course, there will be sectoral sensitivities. And so, for example, in the Australian FTA, there is an agreement in principle that will protect by a very, very long transition period certain vulnerable sectors of the agricultural economy, particularly beef and sheep. But I do not, apart from those sectoral sensitivities, detect ideological or deep-seated resistance to the notion of free trade. I think it's something that Britain is becoming reacquainted with as a result, because for half a century you didn't have a trade policy. For half a century you didn't see yourself as an autonomous actor, an autonomous global actor when it came to trade policy. So of course it requires a recalibration and an adjustment of thinking. And the argument isn't completely won, but I think the argument is going in the right direction. And ultimately, the argument will be won by the results that are manifest from free trade. I mean, how can you turn your eyes as an exporting nation from the most rapidly growing markets in the world? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So, where perhaps some of the politicians may be reluctant, not many of them, ultimately trade makes the case for itself because it lifts the prosperity of all sooner or later.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Now, Anthony, you are in Parliament. You are confronted with these arguments against your political opponents for whatever reason on practically every day. You also represent a rural constituency, long way from London. So how are you explaining it locally to make sure that you get the support? And do you accept that what George said was right? We are winning the argument, but we haven't won it yet. There is still a long way to go.
Yes, so I've got a very rural constituency and also the most valuable fishing port in England, where most of its crab and lobster ends up heading to China. So, we're quite well versed in international trade and where it's going. We haven't won the argument on free trade for precisely the reason that George just mentioned, that we haven't been having it for 40 years. And now that we're getting back into it and we're getting back into the swing of it, we're trying to have to go out there as members of Parliament to actually make the case. And of course, the problem is that free trade is quite dry. It's not many, it's only on sort of fortunate occasions do I get to sit on a panel like this and discuss one of my passions being free trade. But it's so complicated and so technical that actually you can lose people along the way as you try to describe it. And case in point is hormone-injected beef and chlorinated chicken. We can dispel this rumour. It's never going to come to the UK. For it to do so, there would have to be a vote in Parliament to change our sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So unless that happens, which, by the way, it won't, and there will be a rebellion of the likes of which the Prime Minister has never, ever seen yet, it just won't happen. So we have to be better at making the arguments around trade, and it goes back to what I said in my opening remarks. We have to talk about the export potential. Our producers can produce for Australian, New Zealand, Singapore, Japanese markets, and we can push them in that direction because it is a sought-after product. The one other thing I might just add to this very briefly, which is that there is also the importance of improving our own local procurement system, and that's what we've done over COVID. We've seen where farm shops, where supermarkets have taken more of a hand in their own local community through localism, buying locally, supporting that producer in any instance, and it's worked incredibly well.
All right. Now, Philip, your appeal at the beginning was for a more practical view of how this works in practice. Now, is what you've just heard from Anthony and from George, does that make you think that there is a practicality involved in here? Are you concerned that we all talk about free trade, but we don't really mean it, and there are all sorts of non-tariff barriers which are going to make it more difficult, not just for JCBs, but for industry, goods and services in general, to be able to take advantage of what these kind of agreements can give?
Yes, we're doing a lot of talking about it to answer that bit of the question. I'll refer to goods rather than services, because when you start delving into services, it gets very, very complicated, and different nations have very different views. But as far as goods are concerned, we believe that the more you manufacture and the more you have these agreements and actually explain these agreements, that the economic benefits to us as an exporter or manufacturing in country will just improve as time goes on. But you have to put the work in, you have to put the investment in. Yeah. And I've got a couple of examples. India, as you know, Tom, is a large manufacturing area for us. It's taken a long, long time to get really get an indigenous supply chain, probably about 25 years. But you heard Lord Mandelson on the previous panel say, good luck to the Secretary of State going to Delhi in January. She's going to grow old, or I'm going to grow old if I went with her. I think that's exactly what he said. I tend to agree with him entirely. Some difficult negotiations coming. And coming back to, is it going to happen quickly? No. Are we getting into this now? Yes. Are all the words right? Yes. But the practicality is it has to actually be reflected in the balance sheets of the businesses, whether service or goods, and the revenue it gives back to our treasury to actually help us out of the crisis that we've got ourselves into. It's going to take a long time for supply chains to recover. It's going to take a long time for our own, if you like, the box of money that's got interest racking up in it to be even paid back or addressed. So I think that we're talking a number of years, but we're talking, and as much as we can do as quickly as we can after talking, the better. Just stop talking, get on with it.
Thank you. Stephanie, are Canadian people looking forward to this huge influx of British food which Anthony has promised us is coming from Totnes and elsewhere. I mean, what's in it for you? What's in it for Canada? When you look at these agreements, and you said how important free trade agreements were to Canada, and by the way, I agree with every aspect of that. But what is Canada hoping to benefit from the CPTPP when Britain joins, and how the negotiation continues?
So maybe if I start with what's good for Canada just in global terms of market access, but specifically on farmers and agriculture, Canadian farmers tend to ship their goods to the US, right? It's fast, it's easy, they speak the same language, the labeling is fine. So as soon as you go across an ocean, and I think this is part of the issue with businesses wondering about what they're going to do next, and it gets more complicated, we have to think, we as a government, have to think of other ways to facilitate that. And as part of the negotiations, of course, we ask them what they think. We do surveys on, are you even using these existing free trade agreements? Are they working for you? Very eye-opening kinds of conversations, I might say, where many come back and say, way too many forms, couldn't understand what you're asking us to do, why would we bother? And I don't know if it's true of UK companies, but maybe from the kinds of things you're saying, there's a level of ambition too amongst Canadian exporters. Like, they're happy with their X number of millions of dollars a year. And if they can get that just by sending their goods south, why would they go any farther than that? So we have to show them why it is of value, and similarly, the UK will have to do the same. Why would you go to that extra effort? So what does it mean for your company if you can actually ship more diggers or to a different destination? So of course, diversifying is a fantastic thing, as we have seen from supply chain issues and pandemic bottlenecks over the last couple of years. But also, if you're thinking of global learning, and maybe we can do this a little differently because we're in Japan, or because we're in Malaysia, or because we have Canadian wheat coming into the UK and we need to process it in a different manner. It's that global increase of knowledge and transfer of technology. So we're not just buying a widget, we're buying the thought behind it, the process behind it, and that makes it all far more valuable. It also means that ultimately companies can learn from one another and start delivering their good, or indeed their service, in a more efficient manner, which is what you were mentioning earlier, Philip. And that really, if what it means in the end is free trade agreements are actually raising standards around the world and increasing, improving conditions of living for everyone, then this can only be a good thing. I'm sounding a bit like a socialist, eh? But truly, that is the intent, right? We want everybody to have better lives. It's not just about making Canadians rich. It's about making sure that the folks in Senegal are actually getting a better deal as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good free trade argument as well.
Good.
Now, look, Anthony, right at the very beginning in his introductory speech, mentioned it was more than about trade, that it's about defense, it's about our values, it's about security, and so on. And he mentioned the AUKUS deal. Now, George, we are sitting here privately, and we haven't had this conversation so far. So I mean, do be indiscreet if you wish, because I know we can trust all these people here. But why don't you tell us from your point of view? You know, the French were very upset by it all and said all sorts of terrible things about us, and indeed your great country. But why don't you just give us a little hint of what was happening with AUKUS and why that has been so beneficial to security, to defense, and to partnership with our countries?
Well, you know, Tom, you're very tempting, but I'm incapable of indiscretion, as all anyone who knows me would be aware. But I can, without breaching that self-denying ordinance, tell you a little about AUKUS. It's a very important partnership between three like-minded nations, which, as I think it was Shankar Singham said in the last panel, it's not just about submarines. What it's about is a framework of cooperation between three countries, Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, that already cooperate as intimately as sovereign states can across a range of national security and intelligence issues. I mean, we're members of the Five Eyes defence community, intelligence community, I should say. There is the Five Power Defence Agreement, to which Australia and the United Kingdom and others are parties, and there are other international treaties and international arrangements as well. I think we are increasingly aware that countries with shared values and common interests need to cooperate ever more closely. And as I said in my opening remarks, referencing what Liz Truss said to the Conservative Party conference, the trade equities, the strategic and military equities, the diplomatic equities, the values of international development policy, and every vector of cooperation you can imagine, whether it be relationships between universities and other institutions is another that comes to mind. Those who operate in those different sectors come increasingly to realise that collaboration with like-minded partners is increasingly important. Now, when it comes to AUKUS, it's about, as I say, more than submarines. It's about, in particular, the potential to develop and share together a range of capabilities that will that are important to making the world a more secure place, and whose focus obviously is the Pacific. And it's a feature, by the way, of the United Kingdom's re-emergence as a nation that identifies itself as having interests in the Pacific Hemisphere as well, that the United Kingdom is a crucial part of this arrangement. Now, I don't want to go beyond that, other than to emphasise the point that building a lasting partnership based on trust in relation to the development of capabilities that will be decades in the development and use is something that binds our three countries together extremely closely, even more closely if possible than they are at the moment.
George, thank you very much. I mean, that is a great way to end this, this session, just realising the possibilities of the trading possibilities, but also so much wider, as you have just represented, of the CPTPP and beyond. So may I thank you, George, Philip, Stephanie, and Anthony, on behalf of everybody here. Thank you very much indeed for bringing your knowledge, your understanding, and your intellect of what can sometimes be very difficult issues to understand and internationally complicated. But I think that we've gone some way to providing a bit of a spotlight on how this works in practice. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom.